Hey there! If you love exploring Christian philosophy and theology, you're in the right place. The video's about to get started, but first, I want to ask you a question. Do you find the content I produce on this channel valuable? If so, here are some ways you can help promote it. The first is completely free. Give this video a like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. Second, consider doing a one-time donation, kind of like a tip. You can do this in the form of a super chat or super thanks below. Third, consider becoming a patron. Patrons get early access to videos, they get to be a part of a patron-only Facebook group we call TAC Academy, and patrons can participate in the book club that meets on Zoom once a month. The link to become a patron is in the description. Thanks to all my current patrons for your support. Enjoy the interview. Welcome to The Analytic Christian. I'm Jordan. This is the channel that helps you explore Christian philosophy and theology. Today we're looking at a new Ask a Scholar question. And here it is. This one's a little bit lengthy, but I'll read it out first and then we can begin discussing it. It seems like there is a tension between some Christian doctrines and libertarian freedom. If humans have libertarian freedom in the leeway sense, isn't it possible for humans to live a sinless life? If the answer is yes, doesn't that lead to Pelagianism? If the answer is no, why not? One might say, because we have a certain character that limits the range of options we have to choose from. But there's a problem with this response. Either we ultimately get to choose our characters, or we do not ultimately get to choose our characters. If we ultimately get to choose our characters, then it seems like we could have chosen characters such that we always had the option to refrain from sinning. But if that's the case, then we run back into the original worry about Pelagianism. On the other hand, if we do not ultimately get to choose our characters, then how am I morally responsible for sinning due to a character that I did not get to choose? All right. My guest is Dan Speak, and he has co-authored some books with Kevin Tempe related to free will, and he's published himself on free will. So I thought it'd be good to bring him on and have him address this question. So Dan, good to see you again. Thanks for coming on.
Great to see you again too, Jordan. I wish the question you were asking me wasn't so hard, but fair enough. We'll deal with it.
All right. So yeah, I guess where do you want to start with this question?
Well, it seems to, I don't know. You tell me. One of the things that I don't know enough about is there's some technical terminology in your question. Should we sort a little of that out first of all? So what I mean by you're framing the problem, or the problem gets framed here as a challenge, in particular for libertarian conceptions of free will. So maybe I should say something about that to begin with.
I think that's a good place to start.
Okay. So the libertarian, and one thing that I feel an impulse to specify here quickly, right before we jump into it, is that though there's a terminology of libertarianism that gets used in political and economic theory, and also here in the free will literature, on my view, there's no interesting relationship between these positions. Okay, so you can be a libertarian in the free will sense and not be a libertarian in the political economic sense, and you can be and not be a libertarian in this sense and not be so there. I don't think there's any interesting relationship there. So just if any of your listeners have either real enthusiasm for the political economic view or real resistance to it, I hope you'll resist the urge to put those considerations onto this view in freedom of the will. I take it to be a separable one. It's an interesting question, and if it turns out you want to think more about that, Jordan, I'd be happy to. But that's my view. And what's the view that we have in mind here with libertarianism about free will? It's a view about what it takes to be free, to have freedom of the will. And here's the standard way of thinking about it. Libertarianism is a two-pronged thesis. It's the thesis, first of all, that we do enjoy freedom of the will. So, and here we mean normal adult human beings have free will. So will there be cases where maybe a person doesn't have free will? Unusually, maybe, but ordinary people, they do have it. So it's a positive thesis. The libertarian is as it were, optimistic about our having free will. But then here's the second part of that. So that's the first claim. We do have free will. The second part of the claim is what's sometimes called the Incompatibilist Claim. And so it's a slightly more negative claim. It's the claim that if the world were governed by strictly deterministic laws, we wouldn't have this free will. So notice that the libertarian is committed to the view, in virtue of believing that we have free will, that the universe is not causally determined. The world is not such that, given the way the world was in the distant past and the laws of nature, everything that happens unfolds from that necessarily. And another way that sometimes this can sometimes be put maybe overly simply is that there's nothing about the way the world was in the distant past or how the laws of nature were that guarantee that I do anything right now. I could do either of two things. I could continue this conversation or choose to click out of this conversation, right? I could choose to have a sip of my tea or not have a sip of my tea, holding fixed the way the world was in the past and the laws of nature. They don't govern me in such a way that I could only do one thing. I'm going to have a sip now, just
Yeah.
But free choice, free will. Okay, watch how it is.
Yeah. Yeah. This is good.
So the libertarian makes both of those claims. We're free, and we wouldn't be free if the world was causally determined. Okay, so that's one thing to see, is that the libertarian view is, and maybe it's worth just noting, the most standard contrast with libertarianism is what's typically called compatibilism, and that's the view, as you can imagine, that and maybe your viewers are all totally familiar with this, so it's old hat, but just to get it on the table, the compatibilist view is that a person could be free in the relevant sense, even though they were determined, even though the past and the laws of nature guaranteed that they would do each of the things that they're doing. Nevertheless, there's some respect in which they could be relevantly free. And the libertarian is resisting that claim. The libertarian is keeping the claim that we're free, but resisting the claim that we would be free if the determinist thesis were true.
I've interviewed Taylor Swift.
That would
Taylor
be a good
Sear.
get.
I've never interviewed Taylor Swift. I can tell you that.
Taylor Sear is cool, but he's not quite Taylor Swift.
That is a good point. Yeah. So I interviewed Taylor Sear,
Yes.
and on several occasions, but one was about a 30-minute interview where he laid out these views and some arguments for each one. So I would encourage people go check that out. But yeah, so in this question that we started with, it's singling out libertarianism.
Yes.
So to be a libertarian, you need to believe we have free will, and free will is incompatible with determinism.
That's right.
You have to believe those two things to be a libertarian.
That's right, yeah.
Now, so this question says, okay, that view faces a dilemma when it comes to Christian doctrine.
Yeah.
Specifically, how to avoid a heresy while maintaining your view of libertarian freedom.
Yep.
And that heresy is Pelagianism. So maybe you want to say something briefly about what Pelagianism is.
Good. I mean, I'm going to want to nuance a couple of things here, but the standard way of conceiving of the Pelagian heresy was that you could live a perfectly moral life without the help of God by way of the Holy Spirit, right? So one way of thinking about the Pelagian view is, if you're a Pelagian and you think there's a kind of moral perfectionism that the human being is capable of, even without divine aid, right? And the classical view is that's a heresy, because on the standard Christian story, there's some quite fundamental sense in which we are completely and totally indebted to grace, right? We absolutely need God's help for the moral life and for life with God. So you can sort of see the intuitive horn of the dilemma that you've got going for us here, right, Jordan? That isn't there something about the idea that we have this robust kind of freedom that the libertarian is claiming that makes it seem as if, well, does it follow from that we could always, just on our own under our own power, so to speak, do what's right and avoid sinning and make our way into the fullest kind of moral goodness without God's help? And, qua Christians, it looks like we're committed to saying no to that, right?
Yeah. And so that's the tension is, now I bring this, in the question, it says libertarian freedom in the leeway sense.
Good.
And that part's important, because there are going to be incompatibilists who are source incompatibilists, people
Right.
who think, yes, free will is incompatible with determinism. However, that doesn't mean that to be free, I have to have alternative possibilities.
Yes.
I could have only one possibility, one
Yes.
thing I could do, and that's all. Nevertheless, as long as I'm the source of the decision, then um, then I still made the free. It was still free, so long as it wasn't determined.
That's right. Yes. Good. Whereas the leeway view is, I need also genuinely to have been able to do either of two incompatible things, right?
Mm-hmm.
That if I really did join this conversation freely in the leeway sense, then right at the time when I chose to join this conversation, I could have instead decided and succeeded in achieving my effort to just go play with my grandson, right? I could have done that instead.
Mm-hmm.
And the leeway libertarian says that you have free will just in case you have genuine alternative possibilities, right? Whereas the
So
leeway,
this dilemma is meant to target the leeway
yes,
source of the leeway view of libertarian freedom,
yep, okay,
because and the idea is I'm constantly faced with choices. It seems in your experience of either I could do this action, which would be permissible, or I could do this other thing, which is not permissible. And I'm just saying that's a sin, something you ought not
yep,
do.
yeah,
Um, so it seems like we're faced with choices like that all the time. However, if that really is the case, you really do have these alternative possibilities, then it seems like it's genuinely possible that you have the choice to do the right thing in each case,
mm-hmm.
in which it seems like, well, if I can do it in one situation, then I could generalize, and whatever situation you put in front of me across the entirety of my life,
Yeah,
it would be the case that it was always a genuine possibility that I do the right thing.
yeah.
The challenge is that if that really is possible, then that just goes right
Doesn't that lead to
against
yeah,
the idea that Christians need the grace of God, and it's only by that, something external to you, that you would do that. I
yeah,
hope I'm communicating that well enough.
yeah. Well, look, I feel the tension for sure, and there's a way in which, and part of the way you keep pressing this question, and kind of the second part of this keeps the pressure on this, but yeah, in ways we might want to get to, but um, I do think that the way this gets that you're pressing this does put our finger on a very fundamental tension within um, Christian philosophical theology. And I don't think there's an easy response to this. Okay. And one thing to say about that more generally is this is not me trying to evade the question. I want to go directly at it with you. Okay. And think and say maybe some positive things about it. But I do, before doing that, just want to note almost every view about human free will that's got any minimal plausibility to it will face some tensions like this. Maybe not this exact one, but some, right? And so, I'll just note that we're gonna have to choke down some jagged pill someplace on this, at least for the time being. And I want to get that out just so that as we start working with what the libertarian might say about these things, um, we all remind ourselves, but if I were a compatibilist, I would have another set of problems, a deep set of problems about how to handle the problem of evil, for example, that I could try
Mhm.
to bring out, right? Or if you go and keep in mind, like Taylor Sear, I don't know about Taylor Swift, but like Taylor Sear, some of my closest friends are Christian compatibilists, right? And I get why they are. They recognize, well, my problem is dealing with the problem of evil, and okay, I've got the libertarian like me has got some species or other of the problem that you're pressing here, Jordan. And then, some Christians can talk themselves into the no free will at all view, right? There are skeptics about freedom of the will, but of course that's got really difficult consequences for the Christian life as well, since it looks like it's a feature of ordinary Christian orthodoxy that people are, in some robust sense, properly held morally responsible for their choices, especially their choices about whether or not to respond to God and God's love for them in the relevant way. So I just want to note, this is a problem. Let's try to work it out, but let's not let ourselves imagine that there's some view about human agency that some theologian has worked out, and it's there solving all of these problems. And why would anybody be attracted to libertarianism when there's this other one that answers all these problems? There, cards on the table. In my view, there isn't one out there that's solving all these problems. What we have to do is pick our problems, right?
Yeah.
So now, with that thought there, and again, we can think about why I think those other views have the problems they have if it comes to that. But here's the way I want to. There's a at one point Dallas Willard notes in his corpus that he thinks that the fundamental question facing contemporary theology of the spiritual life is how to handle the fact that in the process of our transformation into Christ likeness, both God and human beings are in a cooperative project, and how to get that right such that, as he sometimes puts it, he thinks that grace is the grace of God working in our lives is not incompatible with effort. It's incompatible with earning, right? And so then the question is, so how do we get on that point rightly, especially as a libertarian, such that the contribution of my will is real? It makes a genuine difference, but its essential contribution is by way of cooperation, right? It's doing its work by way of working alongside God. And at least sometimes, I'll get this out for you, Jordan, see what you think. At least sometimes I've been tempted by a pretty controversial thought here, that maybe the way, or when we ordinarily think about free actions, the kinds of things that we go to as basic actions, what are the most basic free actions that we imagine? Well, we think about things like raising your arm. Like, that's a natural one. Like, oh, can you just raise your arm at will? Yes. Okay, so there's a basic free action. Or maybe it's attention. Sometimes that's the right way to think of it. What's the most basic thing I can do? I can attend to something. I can direct my attention to this problem, or direct my attention to what Jordan's saying, or direct my attention to what desire I'm having right now, or whatever, right? And so, and maybe the fundamental action in freedom is directing my attention to something. Well, here's a thought that sometimes strikes me as plausible, and that gives a sort of wedge between the Pelagian heresy on the one hand, and on the other hand, the view that I don't do anything, right? That's the danger, right? On the Pelagian view, it's all on me. On the other end of the spectrum, God's doing everything and my agency is irrelevant, right? Here's a thought. What if the fundamental free action is a letting something happen? And notice that's a phenomenon. There's a phenomenon of allowing a thing. Sometimes it's allowing a thought, allowing a desire to work, allowing someone to respond to you in a certain way. And notice that can be volitional. That's a thing you can decide to do or not do. But what's interesting about it is that it's not quite like raising your hand or directing your attention. It's ceasing doing something, right? And so sometimes I've wondered if the right way to deal with the nub of this problem, right when you get on the nub and you're thinking about what's my fundamental relationship to God's grace and my action, it's still a real exercise of my will, but what I really am deciding most fundamentally in my relationship to God is stop resisting, right? And that's a thing I do, and my will has to do it. I have to stop resisting the movement of God's grace. And so it's a volitional thing I do, but I'm allowing God by God's Spirit to do some work in me. And maybe does that start to get at a way, Jordan, that you think we could sort of split the difference here and be, and that nevertheless that letting it happen would be a genuinely libertarianly free choice. It'd be a thing I do, and that if the universe were causally determined, I wouldn't be. It would, and I have alternative possibilities with respect to it. But it's not a raising my hand or a directing my attention. It's just I'm stopping my fighting. I'm stopping resisting the movement of God. And what do you think?
So I've heard of that sort of model. Now, the person I heard it from was a theologian named Ken Keathley. He has this book on like Molinism when it's applied to soteriology. I
Nice.
forgot the title of the book, but anyway, he calls that the ambulatory model. And it's basically like you're riding in an ambulance. And here's your choice when you're in an ambulance, like you're dying.
Yeah, good.
And there are people that are there ready to work on you and fix you up. And you can either resist or you can just cease to resist.
Yes.
That doesn't mean you're actually like, you're not operating on yourself.
Exactly. Yeah, good.
You are literally just laying there and allowing them to do things to you.
Yeah, good.
Or you could, try to like stop them, get out of the ambulance,
take
whatever.
Take the matters into my own hands. Right. Yeah, good.
Yeah. So I'm not doing anything other than ceasing to resist.
Yeah.
But that seems like the absence of something rather than a positive, it seems like a positive if I'm the one trying to like fix myself.
Yeah, good.
But something that's just like the absence. So it doesn't seem like there's only like two choices. I can either cooperate or resist. It seems like there's three choices, I guess. I mean, cooperation is, I'm sure you get what I'm getting at. I'm cooperating when I'm trying to help, I guess, to some extent, but I'm also cooperating when I just lay there still. And so laying there still seems like the absence of something. Now, I'm thinking of the original problem. Maybe I'll put it back on the screen.
Yeah, good. I mean, some of this gets deeply at the issue about how we're going to conceive of original sin as well, right? Mm-hmm. And at least on notice, I was running two things together here pretty easily that some people will want us to distinguish, and that's the role of God's grace in my initial decisions to come into the life of God versus the role of God's grace in my making progress in discipleship. And I was running those together. There might be people who would want to distinguish those, and they might create slightly different problems depending on which of those you were emphasizing. But I was kind of treating them together in this case.
So let me start, because I think the second paragraph here is like a separate problem that can actually target even source incompatibilism, maybe.
I think that's right.
And so I've separated these kind of into two. The first, I'm just attacking leeway freedom here. So, but yeah, let me think. So going back to that original questions, the original question: if we have libertarian freedom, is it possible for humans to live a sinless life? What would the ambulatory model say to that? Would it?
I don't know what it would say exactly. Now I want to know what Ken Keathley thinks, but sounds like he's a Molinist, which I'm not, which, as we we might have.
You might agree on this point, though. You might.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly. Yeah. One thing to say about this is I do think it's a mistake for Christians in particular to hear the description of libertarian free will and imagine that what it means to be libertarianly free is that you have maximal freedom, right? It's not obvious to me that human beings could have the kind of freedom that we're sometimes imagining in those cases, right? I mean, I have lots of limitations imposed on me, even if you do think that even if you do think that I am capable of libertarianly free choices, it doesn't follow from that I can't jump to the moon. I don't think I could decide to conceive of a round square. I think I couldn't, choke out my grandson, right?
Mhm.
And or choose to choke out my grandson or something like that. Again, people could press on that. I mean, under ordinary circumstances for no good reason or whatever you, right? Maybe I got to save his life and then I could, maybe, but right. Um, and so I wonder if some part of that first thought, some part of the worry that libertarianism presses you towards Pelagianism comes from the thought that in endorsing libertarian free will, one's endorsing a view that really gives to human beings a kind of agential capacity that's much more dramatic than we actually find ourselves with. And there, I just want to note, there's nothing about saying that I can, or that some human beings can, on occasion, make choices independently of the past and the laws of nature. It doesn't follow from that they have the ability, for example, they don't have. Remember, Sartre famously noted that he made it seem like in every free choice, what I'm doing is like recreating myself. Like my free choice to, if I join the French Resistance, that's like I'm reshaping myself into the kind of person who was a French Resistance joiner, and I'm leaving aside I'm killing or destroying or leaving behind the version of me that would have been a taking care of his mother person. And it's this very dramatic reconstruction that has a very divine, there's a sort of maximal picture of ourselves as having godlike powers. And heard like that, you can see why it pushes towards Pelagianism, right? The more we think, well, our capacities are just like God's in God's decision to actualize any world at all, then we start to look like, well, hey, we can whip up anything in ourselves. I don't think that's entailed by libertarianism. And maybe if we soften that blow and we just keep noting, like, look, the libertarian's not committed to. Here's the way you can press me on this, Jordan, but the way I would want to put it for now is this: the libertarian is not committed to self-creation, right? Um, and this is going to come up in that next part of the question about forming one's character. But at least put like this, I'm inclined to put heavy emphasis here. The libertarian's not committed to the view that every human agent, is a causa sui, a cause of him or herself in some quite fundamental way. Maybe there's a subtle way in which the libertarian is committed to us being causa sui in a very small, limited, incremental sense, but not in the today I will decide to make myself into something completely different than I am. So I wonder if that softens some of the blow about the Pelagianism.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I'm going to do my best to apply everything you said to the original problem here.
Yeah.
So it seems like when I'm looking at that first paragraph, if humans have libertarian freedom in the leeway sense, isn't it possible for humans to live a sinless life? Now, I might revise that question slightly and say, isn't it possible for humans to live a sinless life apart from God's work on you or God's grace or whatever?
Right.
Okay, so that would be an important addition to that sentence. I should have added that. But if humans have libertarian freedom in the leeway sense, isn't it possible for humans to live a sinless life apart from the grace of God? It seems like on the kind of scenario you painted, which I'm calling the ambulatory model.
Yeah.
You could say we do have leeway freedom. We can choose to resist or not resist. By me choosing not to resist, that doesn't mean that I can thereby live a sinless life apart from the grace of God. If God wasn't actively working on you, giving you grace, not resisting still wouldn't result in you living a sinless life. You would still need God to be giving you grace. So yeah, maybe that would soften the blow on that question. Because you retain leeway freedom.
Yeah.
But you would still have to answer the question no. The only way you run into Pelagianism is if you answer the question with a yes.
That's right.
But on the model you've offered, you'd still answer the question no Now, I followed up with, well, if the answer is no, then why not?
Yeah.
Your explanation is you still have leeway freedom, like I was saying.
Mm-hmm.
It's just between resisting or not resisting. But not resisting doesn't thereby get you living a sinless life. You still need God's grace.
Yes.
Okay.
And furthermore, I mean, here's another feature of that. I mean, this is why I say this is obviously at the heart of this is how we're supposed to conceive of the notion of original sin or a fallenness, right? And I don't have a worked out theory on this, Jordan. So I don't know exactly what to say. And the thing I will this is true when anybody's talking about the Trinity. I think it's also true when people are talking about the nature of original sin, that we're safest if we just said negative things like it's not this and it's not that. But anytime someone tries to make some positive thesis, if someone tries to say, well, the Trinity is to be understood thusly, you're going to utter a heresy. The same thing is close to being true here with respect to original sin, that if I utter some positive thesis about how I think original sin works, someone's going to think it's heretical. Okay. So, but with that said, I'll try, right? And here's my temptation is to think something like, it can be tempting to think that libertarianism, it's a danger of being a libertarian, I think, is that the people who've been attracted to libertarianism have also, as a consequence of being attracted to libertarianism, also been attracted to what I want to think of as a kind of radically individualistic or homuncular conception of the agent in her social environment. So you can think, if I have this kind of freedom of the will, then there's a way in which I can operate, so to speak, independently of the structures and social pressures that are around me, that are in my environment and my upbringing. I can just bracket those and just act. And what I think I want to just note is, I don't think that's a consequence of libertarianism in itself. Okay. And then I just want to note, I don't find it very plausible to think of human agency as that far bracketed off from our social environments. And it turns out that I think very bad dispositions for human beings run through the course of just being in tribes, and then the tribes being integrated into larger tribes and having to compete for. And the way I would be tempted to put it is, the reason I think the answer to the question, some part of the reason I think the answer to the question, no, it's not possible for a person to lead a sinless life, even though they're libertarian agents. The no answer there is partly grounded in the thought that for any person that comes into this world, part of what it means for the world to be a fallen one and for the person to be a fallen one is that she will inevitably be finding herself trying to operate having been raised in and integrated into a set of outlooks and worldviews and dispositions and what have you that are already poisonous in lots of ways. And so inevitably you will find yourself deploying your libertarian freedom in ways that are contrary to your fundamental good, that go against your flourishing, that go against the will of God, which I take to be all roughly equivalent thoughts. And so just being a libertarian agent isn't going to save you from the fall, because just being a libertarian agent doesn't give you simple effective leverage over the fact that you're a social creature embedded in social structures that are bent in on themselves and that cause you to be bent in on yourself.
Okay. This might be a good time to transition to the second type of question. So what's going on with the second type, and I have a slide that may characterize this more clearly, is saying, okay, well, say we get out of the first problem, because the first one's only targeting leeway freedom.
Mm-hmm.
And so you get out of it by some appeal to like a source incompatibilism. I don't think that's the move you made. I don't think you said, so my answer is source incompatibilism.
Yeah, that's right. I'm attracted to a view whereby I'm attracted to leeway, that is the kind of incompatibilism, kind of libertarianism, where people really do, at some fundamental level, need to have alternative possibilities. And that when I hear the source stories, the best source stories, it always seems to me that sourcehood and alternative possibilities at the fundamental level are going to go together. It's going to be unusual. I think it's going to be. I'll be surprised to discover that I could be the source in the way that human beings have to be the source without having had alternative possibilities. But there's a bunch of controversial things in there.
Yeah. So, yeah, I won't get into that. I'm aware of like flicker of freedom type things. Oh, well, just to complete that story, I want to make sure I'm thinking through this on the spot. So I'm
Sure.
Once you're gone, like once this interview's over, all I've got is the tape, and I want to make sure that I've thought through it really well. So it seems like you're almost telling a kind of story that can answer why, because in that, I'll put it back up. You want to say no to the question. If humans have libertarian freedom in the leeway sense, isn't it possible for humans to live a sinless life apart from the grace of God? It seems like you're saying nope.
I want to say no.
But I ask, well, why not? And your story kind of combines a version of original sin.
That's right.
That doesn't conceive of it as like us inheriting the guilt of Adam or something like that, but rather it's just we are born into a social structure that is already disposed to very sinful type things.
Yeah.
And we can have this leeway freedom like you're talking about, but once you're planted, it's almost like being planted into bad soil.
That's right.
Or something like that. Like you could be put into that social structure, but that's going to have an influence on you. It doesn't determine you, but it has influences on you, and that's going to cause you to, I don't know if cause is the right word, but your leeway freedom that you do have will be impacted by that social structure.
That's the suggestion.
And so that's why you would, apart from the grace of God, live a sinful life. You would choose sin, but nevertheless you still have leeway freedom because you could choose to not resist the grace of God.
Yes.
So I think that's the picture you're painting.
That's right. Yeah.
That's okay. Yeah. Okay, that's helpful. So now let me turn to the other dilemma.
Yeah.
Targeting source incompatibilism, and I have a different slide for this one, so let me go to that. Here's the dilemma. Do we ultimately get to choose our characters?
Mm-hmm.
And if the answer is yes, then it just seems like you have to say you could have chosen a character that was such that you would never sin.
Yeah.
But then that seems to lead to Pelagianism.
Mm-hmm.
If you answer the question no, then it seems like, okay, so you say, well, then it's not possible to choose a character such that we never sin. But then that sounds a lot like you were determined to have a character such that you would sin.
You can see that I'm going to want to, insofar as this is the dilemma, right? I want to get between the horns of it. But can we, right? Does it make sense? Mm-hmm. And try this. There's some respect in which I have control over my character, and there's other respects in which I don't. Look, every Christian has to concede that we don't have control over the fundamental structure of who we are. That was given to us by God, right? So there's one sense in which the basic structure of who I am is not something I chose. So already we're prepared to sort of recognize that. We should be prepared to recognize that. What I'm hoping is that what the libertarian can say is that genuine libertarian freedom gives us the capacity to contribute to our character, to make contributions to our character with God's help that will constitute its being mine I will have a kind of ownership over it. It will be mine. But again, not because I whipped it up whole cloth by my immediate willing, but by way of what you might think of as incremental adjustments that I gain insight about myself with God's help. And then from that point of insight, I see that there's something that needs to change about me. And then with God's help, I work on that. And that constitutes a change in my character. And then that takes me up to another level at which I'm able to see, oh, there's this thing about me that needs to change, another thing. And then, but now God was helping me to recognize that. And now I get to work on changing that thing with God's help. And those are incremental changes that constitute a way in which it still counts as my character, right? But I'm rebuilding the ship at sea, right? I was given the ship that I was sailing on, and then now I've started to make tweaks to it as I go along the way with God's help, and it still gets to be my ship, but it's not that I just whipped it up whole cloth, but it's also not that I had no authority over it, right? I had some. And so that's the kind of big picture that I would try for.
I guess that, to me, that kind of sounds like, in some sense, you do ultimately choose your character. I guess at some fundamental level, you have certain dispositions and so forth, but you are able to even change some of that throughout the course of your life.
Yes.
And in that sense, you do ultimately determine your character.
I mean, careful there, right? Just because I want to put it in terms of cooperation still, right? Mm-hmm. So my agency is relevant to the character I end up with, but and causally relevant, I think. But grace is a part of that too, right? And there are you were sort of toying with this thought. There are some fundamental things, like so. Look, I have a panic disorder, right? Anxiety more generally, but a panic disorder too. Let's just suppose, for the sake of argument, just for simplicity's sake, that constitutes just a certain kind of neural imprecision, right? Like, it's tempting to put it like this, that there are these serotonin reuptake inhibitors that aren't doing their job right in my neural structure. Let's just imagine you can simplify panic and say that's there. Mm-hmm. Look, can I make progress on that? Yeah, it turns out I can get leverage over it to a certain degree. I can get leverage over it by certain kinds of cognitive behavioral exercises, and there are medications that can help me with that, and there's prayer, right? But it's not going to surprise me at all if it turns out that there are sort of fixed features of my personality that are relevantly connected to my dispositions to anxiety. That's just me, right? Now, the best version of me knows how to deal with that, is not stopped by that in various ways. But that's still that part. I don't, and I actually do think a lot of Christians are kind of damaged by the thought that they find some fundamental features of their characterological situation, and they think, well, if I'm a Christian now, that whole picture of me has to go. No, that the idea of redemption is that the crooked timber can be put to good use, right? And some of it has to be replaced, but there's some of it such that it's me, and replacing it would mean making me somebody other than who I am. And so the picture I'm imagining here is of my contributing to my character incrementally, but with the timber I've got, right? Mm-hmm. And the timber I've got, I was given. That's how that came to me by way of God and nature. And now, but I can work on it with God's help, and do so because I have libertarian agency, and get God's help in a way that respects my libertarian agency, such that at the end of the day, God and I will be able to say together, it's me, right? I contributed to this, and yet I couldn't have done it without the help of God.
I like how you said that you contribute to your character. So I used the term a moment ago about you ultimately determine it.
Yeah.
in some sense, you ultimately contribute
Yeah, right.
to the character,
That's
right?
right.
It would be a mistake to think that, oh, well, you just didn't really have much say about it. It
That's right.
seems like that's not capturing the kind of control that you have over the development of your character.
That's right. And you could partly put that in the but for clause, right? If I didn't exert my effort in these ways, my character wouldn't have changed, right? Um, God was ready to join me and help me to have my character changed in these ways, but God, He wasn't going to do it without my cooperation, right? And I think that's an important picture of spiritual formation for people to see, right? Is if you think um, God's going to do it, it's going to change you into a decent human being, for example, make you less make you unselfish, make you not so small-minded and petty, make you not so angry at everything, just by boom like that without your effort. That's an effort. That's a mistake. And if you watch Jesus's teaching about how people's lives change, he's almost always appealing to the way that their agency has to join it.
Mhm. One thought I had as you were explaining this is, does this conflict with that original response you gave of the original response sounds very much like I'm not actively doing things.
Yeah, good.
But on this, for the second part of the problem, it sounds like, but I am cooperating with God.
Yeah, yeah.
And not just cooperating in the sense of not putting forth any, not performing actions or something
Good.
like that. Do you get what I mean?
I
Like,
do.
is
Yeah, yeah.
there
No,
is there a
nice.
tension there between the responses you gave?
Yeah, maybe. Let me see if I can resolve them this way. The way I was trying to bring out that point about letting something happen was, if you think about what the most basic form of free actions might be, and at least I'm tempted by the thought that maybe the most basic form of my free action is in letting something happen. Not all of our free actions are basic free actions. So think of it like this. Here's a standard way to think about the what sometimes gets called, um, tracing. Suppose I make the decision, free, totally free and libertarianly free decision to get drunk, right? And then I drive, and then I run over somebody's mailbox, right? And you imagine somebody, you imagine the person, you imagine me defending myself against the neighbor who's like, you ran over my mailbox, what are you doing? And I'd be like, yeah, you can't blame me, I didn't do it freely. They're like, what are you talking about, you did it freely? And I'd say, well, look, I had no alternative possibilities at the time I was running over the mailbox. I mean, I was drunk. And no one will accept that. And the reason they won't accept this is because they'll trace it back, right? They'll say, well, maybe it's true that at the time you ran over the mailbox, you couldn't have done anything other than run over the mailbox. But you could have done something before, such that if you had done that, you would have had alternative possibilities with respect to this. And so the running over the mailbox, you might say, isn't a basic free action, but it's a free action because it's properly related, to the basic free action. So here's the thought: is that maybe it can be like that. That if my story is right, and I don't know if it is, and I'm not totally committed to it, Jordan, and for reasons that you're pressing on right here. But here's the way I might try to resolve it, if it could work. It would be, maybe at the most fundamental level, the most basic free actions are allowings, but there are free actions that are not basic free actions that are doings, right? And that's like, you want to stop being so mean, right? Then commit to meditating on the gospels, right? That's a thing you do, right? Of course, you also ask God to help you in the meditations, that watching the life, that having the life of Jesus become the operative backstory of your mind would make you stop being so mean and irritable, right? If you're living fearfully, right, and you're like, hey, the thing to do is, you know, we learn from Aristotle, we got to bend the stick. And if I know I'm fearful, then the thing to do is kind of err on the side of not being so fearful and do some things that the person who wasn't fearful would do. And that's the thing I do. And then God joins that and allows my character to be changed. I start imitating, um, brothers and sisters in Christ who are better at these things than me. That's a thing I do. It might not be basically free, but it's still free because you can trace it back to this of letting God do his thing. That's the hope. What do you think? Does it sound like it's got the chance of being coherent?
Yeah, so I want to make sure I'm understanding it right. I'm going to stick. One thing I struggle with is patience. So let's
Yeah.
let's pick on me for a minute. Okay,
Yeah.
so I struggle with patience. I think, well, I want to develop a character such that I become more patient. How do I do that? This isn't the entire picture, but a part of the story of how to go about doing that is to pray.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
That's right.
Again, I'm not, for those out there,
Yeah.
I know that
Right.
prayer alone is not
Right.
gonna
Yeah.
fix it, but
Right.
part of the equation. All right, now, so prayer is something active. Well, I guess maybe maybe this is a bad example. I know that there are people out there that are like, no, it's, you reach these like higher levels where it's like the
Yes.
emptying, so
Yeah. Fair
maybe maybe that's why I'm not patient. I don't reach those levels, but
enough.
uh yeah, prayer to me anyway seems pretty active. So or reading scripture, I
Yeah.
guess maybe
That's right.
that's a better example. So I'm going to read scripture and meditate on what I've read there. Now, so that's something active. On your scenario, that's not a basic action.
Maybe that's not a basic for
Maybe
you.
that's not the basic action. Maybe you can trace that action back to the basic action of letting
Letting God
ceasing to
work.
resist and
Yeah.
just letting God work on you.
Yeah.
Okay. Interesting. Okay. Yeah, this is good. You've helped me a lot. So if I return to that slide,
Yeah.
it seems like there's probably the question is too vague as it's put. Uh, and because it's like, well, what do we mean by ultimately get
That's right.
to choose our characters? What does that really mean? And does that leave room for, otherwise it seems like a false dilemma. Does that leave room for this kind of picture of God and I cooperating? It doesn't, it seems like there's three options, right? So it's like God could be doing all the work and you do none of the work. Another one is you do all the work and God does none of the work. And then there's this gray zone, this gray
Yeah.
area where it's
Right.
you and God are working together. But like we distinguished before, that doesn't automatically mean I'm actually like doing stuff.
Yeah.
It could be I'm ceasing to resist, but that still counts as a kind of cooperation with God. And so maybe maybe to some extent you want to say this could be a false dilemma. It would depend on how we define ultimately get to choose our characters.
That's right.
What you're definitely comfortable saying is we ultimately get to contribute to the character we develop, such that we would not have that character were it not for what we contributed to it.
I probably am committed to the idea that there's something like a false dilemma in it. But I do want to note that it's a super illuminating false dilemma because as I read the Christian tradition, it's committed to the idea of getting between these two things. And it's just not as easy as it first seems to get between them. And it's as a result, it's very natural to get pushed in one extreme or the other on this. And
Mhm.
staying in the center and having a genuine account about how it is that um, our genuinely free contributions make a difference, and yet God's work is the even primary thing. I think we probably need to commit to that on a broadly Christian view, that God's work is primary in the effort for us to both be converted and be transformed. And I think it's really hard. It's also I think it's super interesting. I think the contemporary action theory ought to be brought to bear more and more on this sort of. I mean, the way I think of it right here, to be honest, Jordan, is we're on a kind of applied philosophical theology here because this is the thing that matters to like the person who is only maybe nominally interested in philosophy but is deeply interested in becoming a better follower of Jesus, right?
Mhm.
Maybe only nominally interested in philosophy but deeply interested in becoming a better parent or a better person or less of an a-hole in various ways, right? And like there better be some that it's supposed to be part of what recommends Christianity to you, that it's got an account of this, and that real transformation can occur. And it's not, I don't think it's accidental that I'm appealing to Dallas Willard's corpus here, because I think he was consistently really good on the idea that we should not be tolerating people whose story is, yes, I'm a Christian, but I'm still essentially the same jerk I was before I became, like, that is just not the picture of the gospel. The gospel is this powerful force of God's movement in his kingdom work that makes people into better persons than they were before. And if we're not tapping into that, it seems to me like, well, something's wrong with the story. And it can be right at the sort of structure of philosophical theology, the way we're thinking about what is the relationship of my agency to God's in the process.
All right, well, that seems like a good place to sum up. So I really enjoyed this. I found it helpful. It's got me thinking. I will say this. So thank you again, Dan.
Of course.
And if you, the viewer, have a question that you want to ask a scholar, then you should become one of my patrons, because I choose questions like this, like we've been discussing, that people submit, and contact a scholar that specializes in the area and interview them. So please consider becoming a patron. You can do that by clicking the link in the description of this video. All right, well, thanks again, Dan, and stick around for just a second. To everyone else, see you next time.